Hi, welcome to Quirky Queen's Journals. So today I am doing a sort of art journal page spread. This is 300 GSM A5 size watercolor paper, and I am using titanium buff and raw umber and Paynes grey acrylic paints, and I am starting with a different approach than I normally do. Normally I do the lines, and I have found myself almost painting in a formula, and I've been getting bored with it, and I realised it's because I'm approaching it the same way all the time. So I'm changing it up. I'm painting it on first. So I used a colour shaper, and that was a cake decorating tool. And this is a skewer that's been used a lot. So I've basically applied the 3 acrylic paints, each using a different tool to try and get a different effect. So it's actually quite refreshing not starting with the pens that I normally start with. Now this is drawing ink from Winsor and Newton. I was gifted this by a relative, so it doesn't have an information sheet. Now, as far as I can work out from an advert for it that I found, it is waterproof. But don't quote me on it because I can't be certain. I do love using the skewer to draw it with. So I also did some splatters, which is not a method I normally use. For all I like to be a bit flamboyant and kind of wild, and I'm doing quite like flippy gestures there, I tend to avoid splatters and splashes because it feels a wee bit like a lack of control, which totally goes against painting intuitively and, you know, just trying to do what the painting tells you to do. So another thing I've done as well is this is a narrow nibbed pen, and it is waterproof, but it does take a while to dry to reach that waterproofness. But normally when I do the lines, I start from the edge of the page, and I have drew a box on the left hand side one, and I've drew some sort of castle it looks like on the right hand one, but I've started the lines within the page. Now this is a sort of pastry egg brushing tool. It's very delicate, but I like the way that it is delicate, so it doesn't matter how much pressure I put on, it stays quite delicate. But I was just seeing if I could get some movement in the lines with it. Now this is the only piece of collage I use here, and this is cadmium yellow and indigo blue mixed together. I'm sure that's what it was. No, I think it's not. It's yellow ochre and indigo blue mixed together. So I think this colour combination is quite kind of like moorland, like quite windy, you know, really quite not nice weather, very windy, very cold. I love doing abstract art. It's my absolute favourite. I love not planning. I love seeing, I mean, where this begins and where it ends up is very different. But I had gotten myself in a rut because I'd used a process I'd followed had worked, and so I just kept following it. But that's not really, to me, abstract art is about having fun. It's about expression, and it is about spontaneity and about being flamboyant. And so following a formula is not any of those things. And I hadn't realised I was doing it. And I'm not even sure what made me realise that I was doing it. And I'm not saying it's wrong, because you do need to find, there's ways that will work for you, and I'm always going to prioritise lines and shapes really over everything else, because I just love lines and shapes. There is a channel on YouTube called Contemporary Art Issue, and what he says is be you, but be radically you, as in what it is that you... That's what made me do this different method. That's what made me think. I was watching it before I made these, and he says that you have to be you. You must be you. You must be consistent, but you must be radically you. And that made me realise that a lot of the time as well, I find that I hold back. I think, oh, I'm not sure how that medium works. Oh, I'm not sure if people on YouTube would like that. Oh, I don't know if that would be considered artistic. So lots of sort of, self-doubts and lack of knowledge. Really, I've been kind of allowing it to hold me back. And later on in this painting, I pull out a red soft pastel and I put it back because I thought, oh, that's too radical. But I end up using it and it is wonderful. So I had splattered some red oxide acrylic paint on these pictures before I started covering over with the white acrylic paint, and I thought they had dried, but they obviously haven't, because I'm assuming that when you splatter, I suppose you're putting down thicker blobs than you normally would. So when I started putting the white paint over them, I thought, oh, I'm smearing it everywhere, this is a disaster. But then I thought, nope, we're just going with it, because this is where we're at and this is what's happened. And so now we're using the red oxide on a massive scale. I do think the one on the right looks like a toilet sign. So I do rectify that. The colours are still quite landscape-like, which I love landscapes. I love looking out over magnificent scenery where it's like majestic. I mean, I live fairly near to the Trossachs and, the beginning of the Highlands in Scotland. And I don't think I'd ever be able to convey that much magnificence on a piece of paper. So there was a point to that. So yeah, so I do avoid doing landscapes, to be fair, because I think anything I do as a landscape's never going to convey properly. And I also like to think of abstract art as emotion. It's something from within. I think the big black marks on here have really helped just bring it back from being that landscape look. So this is white oil pastel. Now, I love using the different mediums, because the oil pastel, when the paint or something else goes over that, it brings out a difference in it. So that bit of resistance will, it just adds something extra to the painting. This is willow charcoal that I'm using. Suppose I'm trying to put a bit of a shadow, maybe. And I've joined it up to the line there. Another thing I really like as well is finding some way to connect every layer on the page. And I think that's why I love lines so much, and I try to find as many different ways to draw them as possible. So this is watercolor pencils, and this is something else that I don't ever use. This is a blue-grey colour. I'm hoping it's similar to the Paynes grey that I used earlier. That circle is a bit well defined there. I usually like them to be a bit more rickety and a bit more wobbly. I'm sure the paint will help. So putting the water on top of that watercolour pencil though, I love it because you've got the sharpness of the actual line, but then you've got the kind of blurriness around it. And you've almost created kind of two different types of lines, or a line plus a shape. And, I can see form starting to appear in it because it does have those differences. This is brown ochre. I'm enjoying putting lines around these red oxide shapes, clearly. They're a bit blocky. So I'm trying to, I suppose, bring them to life a bit more. Something that I noticed about having this different approach is I was less precious about it. I wasn't kind of berating myself if I felt like it wasn't kind of going anywhere. And also, I think generally I feel like the way that I used my brush strokes in that were just a wee bit more flamboyant than normal. I think I felt more creative overall because I was working with something different, and also I didn't know what decision that I was making next. So basically the abstract paintings I'm going to always try and take a different approach, a different starting point, as much as possible. I'm sure I will run out of ideas eventually, maybe. Hopefully not. So these paintings have gotten very busy, there's not really any emphasis in it, anything, because there's emphasis on everything. There's so much going on. And I think that's part and parcel of, doing the painting. For me, this is my perspective of it. It's almost like creating as much as you can and then choosing what you want to keep, what's important to you. And part of that, I feel, is the painting will tell you. You'll make a layer and you'll just think, oh, that's it, and all of a sudden everything just clicks into place. So for me, that's what this red pastel did. All of a sudden, the whole page just came alive, and all of a sudden I looked at it differently, and I loved it. I do bring out the blue pastel in a minute, and I kind of was like, oh, what have I done? I felt like I'd ruined it. I thought, oh, it's like the American flag. When you use kind of dark green and dark red together, it can give off Christmas vibes. Well, that's how I felt when I used the blue chalk pastel. It made me think of like flags. I think the colours are both so vibrant, and they're obviously like very well known to be used, to represent like American flags and British flags. So, but I put water on them, and I don't know whether it's the way that I've put them down, or how much colour I've put on, or the way that I use the water on it, I don't know. But all of a sudden they worked together. I do think I put a lot more of the red down. I think I used the red pastel slower, and I pressed harder. So when I've put the water on, it's the intensity of the paint is much more opaque. Whereas with the blue, it's quite watery, it's not blocky. You can see differences in the line itself, like gaps almost. Whereas with the red pastel, it was a very, I don't want to say clean. It was a very opaque line that didn't have a lot of clearer gaps in it. So soft pastels are something that I've only ever used as a kind of addition to paintings before, as in something to add in a little bit of colour or a little bit of texture, and here they became the absolute main feature of the paintings. And, I'm not sure I would have done that if I'd started the same way that I normally do. I also end up creating a lot of white space on these pictures, but if, it looks white to be initially, but after a second or two, you'll notice, there's a lot of different shades and shapes underneath. Like this yellow ink that I'm putting on just now, this is so strong that it actually, it does start, it appears very strongly through the white paint when I put it over it. And I really think that helped make the painting as well, because it added another connection between the lines. And also, I think that the red, blue and yellow, I always avoid those colours together because I think, oh, it looks like a child's painting. And I actually think they really worked in this instance. So at this stage, I knew that it was time to, to get rid of some areas, but I wasn't sure what I was going to choose and what I wasn't, which is why I've literally went for the corners first of all. I'm like, right, let's tidy this bit up and see how it looks. And I never intended to get rid of so much, but I literally end up, removing at least half the painting. But do you see what I mean about the shapes and the colours and even the textures from underneath are coming through? So I have found myself doing 2 paintings at a time lately, and I think it's just, there's less waiting around, so I suppose you're not thinking so much, but I do find that I feel more relaxed. I don't overly think about composition the same way. I don't know whether or not having the 2 of them out helps it happen more naturally rather than you trying to divide the paper up in your head and sticking a focal point down, which doesn't really sit well, because when people talk about contrast and they go, oh, I'll make that area the focal point by making it more black and white together, and I feel like that's forced. Like, I want it to happen naturally. So these paintings obviously end up with a lot of white space. However, I think that if you were to basically just keep the paint and the chalk pastel lines that are not under the white paint, if you were to just put that onto a white piece of paper, I don't think you would get the same effect. And I don't think even, like, there's a way that the lines move because of the layers that they've went over and like the different mediums they've went over, and I don't think you could achieve that on just a blank sheet of paper. And the same for the white spaces themselves. The brush strokes are, it's not like a glaze, it's heavier than a glaze, but you could still see through it a bit, and also it's got a lot of heavy brush strokes on it. And again, if it wasn't going over all the different mediums that it's going over, or even just, the different layers, the different level of layers, you wouldn't have, the white space wouldn't look the same. The white space itself tells a story when there's stuff underneath it. So I'm even taking out some of the chalk pastel lines as well. And I think that actually here was the making of it, because it allowed that yellow line that's at the top kind of shine through. It put more emphasis on it. Is that right? I'm a self-taught abstract artist. I think that's the first time I've ever called myself that. I'm self-taught. So I try and make sense of things along the way. But another thing that the guy on Contemporary Art Issue said was that, you know, you need to find your own way to put the paints or whatever onto the paper or the canvas or whatever it is that you're using, you know, and that's, you know, part of making your own signature. So I try and make art that it's not actually meant to represent anything or be like, you know, an object or anything, right? But I always do end up seeing something. And to me, the one on the left is like a cat that's got one of those, you know, when they go to baseball games and they have that baseball cap on with the cans and the big straw. That's what that makes me think of. And the one on the right is like a sheep. Don't know why. That's just what I see in them. So I'm just going over the lines at the top of the right hand side picture because they'd gotten a bit lost in the white paint. But I did it when the paint was still wet. So I've got some soft pastel splatters on the white paint. And I thought about moving them and then I thought, oh, I'm just going to make that worse. So just putting a wee coat of white paint over the top and that's it, just to deal with the worst of it. So that's it finished now and I'm really, really pleased with them. And I hope you enjoyed and I hope to see you soon. Thanks very much for watching.